Greetings, class, and welcome to your very first day in biology. Today we're going to start with Chapter 1, which is Biology, Exploring Life. So before we begin, make sure that you have a pen and paper handy so that you can take good notes for this lecture, because there will be questions following the lecture, and also it would help you with studying and to make sure that you're able to complete your homework and quizzes. All right, so let's begin. First off, there are three big ideas for this chapter. We'll start off with what is biology and what is life. We'll talk about the process of science and scientific investigation. We'll also discuss the 5 unifying themes in biology. So let's start. So the definition of biology is the scientific study of life. But what exactly is life? How do we define life? So scientists have come up with a few things that can help us determine whether something is alive or not. So the properties of life include order. Life is full of order. Just think, the smallest parts of our bodies consist of cells and organelles and atoms, and then kind of go up into tissues and organs, and then our entire being. So life has order. Things that are alive are able to reproduce either by sexual reproduction or by asexual reproduction. So for example, different plants can bud off of themselves and produce exact copies of themselves. Growth and development, just think that babies start off as just a single cell and then are able to grow and develop into adults. Energy processing, so typically in the form of food, intaking calories and nutrients. Regulation. So for example, our bodies are able to regulate our temperature. They respond to their environment. So we are responsive to stimuli. And I like to think of stimuli in terms of either being positive stimuli or negative stimuli. So something positive, you smell something really, really good cooking for breakfast. It helps you get out the bed in the morning, right? So you're cooking pancakes or something that smells delicious. That's a positive stimulus. And then a negative stimulus could be maybe like a dog chasing you down the street, right? So you're able to respond to your environment and then make changes based on those stimuli. And then lastly, evolutionary adaptation. So you're able to adapt to your environment. Different things have happened over time to make sure that we are able to live successfully in different environments. Right? Here's another definition to look at. The cell is the structural and functional unit of life. And this definition pops up everywhere. So I would make sure that I know that and put that down in your notes. All right, so here's another page just showing the different types of things that define life. So looking at that, how would you define life? Think about it. If you want to, go ahead and let me know. We'll put it in discussion, okay? Biologists arrange the diversity of life into 3 domains. So taxonomists, these are the group of people that name species and classify them into groups. Typically, these groups are based on where they live, what they eat, the different habitats, things like that. So there are 3 main domains. So the domains include bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. All right, so the 3 main ones. So bacteria are typically found in the largest range of places, the most diverse places. Archaea are typically found in very extreme environments. So think of volcanoes, the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. That's where you'll find archaea. And lastly, eukarya. They include protists, they include fungi, so just fungus, right? Plantae, which are plants, and animalia, which are animals. So human beings are actually in the animalia portion of this eukarya domain. All right, so here just another picture. We have our bacteria, our archaea, our eukarya. Just so many different types of things that we can be grouped into. So, to which of the 3 domains of life do we belong? Let's go ahead and think about that. Human beings, where do we fit in? So, biologists study life across a very, very huge range of scales, from the very smallest molecules or atoms in a cell to the entire planet. So they're able to divide this huge scope of biology into a series of something called structural levels. So these emergent properties, they result from the specific arrangement and interactions among parts. So let's make that easier to understand. So we've all heard of an atom, probably, right? Or a molecule that is the very, very smallest form of life. And to make up a living organism, we start that atom, that molecule. They then make up something called organelles. And organelles are just like teeny tiny organs that exist within our cells. Next up, we have cells, which is the smallest structural and functional unit of life. And next up, a bunch of cells make up a tissue. So for example, a bunch of liver cells make up the organ or the liver tissue, we'll say. All right. A bunch of those tissues coming together make up an organ. So first we have those liver cells that make up liver tissues, and those liver tissues will make up the liver, which is an organ we have in our bodies. All right. Lastly, we have the organism. So this could be represented right here by the fish or by a person. And we're made up of all those different things that make us who we are. Next, we have a population. That population lives in a community. That community forms an ecosystem. And then the biosphere is composed of many, many ecosystems. Okay, so going from smallest to largest, if that's easier for you, just determine what we are made of and then where we are living and how we are living, right? So looking at these different types of different levels of biological organization, which one of these would include all of the others on a list? Would it be a cell, a molecule, an organ, or a tissue? So just hint, look at which one of these would contain the most things. All right, so next let's go on to the process of science. And that is how scientists actually come up with experiments and how we go through that step-by-step process to get the results that we need. Okay, so what is science? So science is a way of knowing, an approach to understanding the natural world. So science uses evidence-based inquiry. So asking a question and then finding evidence to either support or disprove that question that you have about the natural world. So the scientific theory or approach, these are important to know. It involves observation. So looking around you at the world and seeing something that you want to test, right? You have a hypothesis, which is an educated guess. So next we have a prediction based on that guess. We can then test our hypothesis, usually by experimenting or just making more observations. And at the end, we analyze our data and see if that helps to either prove our hypothesis or disprove our hypothesis. So lastly, a scientific theory is formed from this original observation. So it's a very broad in scope and it's actually supported by a large body of evidence. So scientific theories that we pretty much take as law now, they had to go through lots of experimentation and lots of reproduction to make sure that this theory was correct. So let's look at an example of a scientific process. All right, so first our observation, we have a flashlight here, but it doesn't work. You kind of hit on your hand a couple times. It does not turn on. So the question is, why doesn't this flashlight work? So let's try out a couple different things. And I'm sure you probably do this in your everyday life or have done this before. So our first hypothesis is the batteries are dead. Our next hypothesis is, or number 2 is, the bulb is burned out. So how would we actually test this hypothesis? So looking at hypothesis number 1, which is just our educated guess, knowing a little bit about flashlights, right? Our prediction is that replacing the batteries will fix the problem. So what we can do to actually test that prediction is to replace the batteries, right? So let's see what happens next. Let's see if that came true. So the results after replacing our batteries, the flashlight still does not work. That means our hypothesis about replacing the batteries was not true. All right, so let's go back to our hypothesis number 2. Our bulb is burned out. So our prediction is that by taking the old burned out bulb out and screwing in that new one, this will fix the problem. So a way to test that prediction is to actually replace the bulb. The results. The flashlight finally works. This means our hypothesis is supported, and that proved that our educated guess was right, that the bulb was burnt out, and we were able to prove our hypothesis. So I'm sure this is probably something you've all done before, something we do in our very daily lives without even thinking about it, right? So we perform experiments all the time, and that means we're scientists, right? All right, I agree. So when we have an experiment or a hypothesis, they can actually be tested using controlled experiments. And for controlled experiments, they have 3 major parts for controlled experiments, just to make sure we get a good result and a good testable result each and every time. All right. So in an experimental test of a hypothesis, the one thing that is being manipulated or changed is called the independent variable. This is the stuff that the scientist or you as a scientist are kind of messing with, right? So you're manipulating it. So that's the independent variable, even though that's the thing that we're kind of changing around. The component that is used to measure or judge that outcome is called the dependent variable. So the dependent variable, it depends on the independent variable. And lastly, for that controlled experiment, we have to have something called a control group. So for example, if we're testing a bunch of acids to see how strong they are, the control group will be maybe just a glass of water, something that is not reactive at all, just to make sure that our base components are correct. Okay, so we have independent variable, number 1, dependent variable, number 2, and our control group, which is number 3. So scientists actually test hypotheses about the evolutionary relationships of a red panda. If you've never seen a red panda before, that is what is on the front of your textbook. It kind of looks like a raccoon that is red. And so scientists wanted to know, is this thing a panda or it is a raccoon? So based on observations of their physical similarities, right, the red panda looks a lot like a raccoon. They both have that kind of stripy tail and the little thumbs and stuff, right? So other scientists think that the red panda is more closely related to the giant panda because of their diet of bamboo and their habitats. But the study of the red panda's DNA comparing both to red pandas and to raccoons determined that red pandas are the only living species of their own family. So testing these hypotheses, these observations in nature, the scientists figured out like, hey, even though it looks like this or it lives like this, these two groups are really not related to this red panda in a direct way. Okay, so looking at this, here's our red panda. See how close it looks to a raccoon? The face looks kind of similar, and it has that stripy tail. But if you look at a panda face, it's also kind of similar, and they're going to be eating bamboo. All right, so the process of science is repetitive. It is non-linear, and it is collaborative. So what this means, to be able to form and test a hypothesis is at the core of science. This endeavor is influenced by 3 different factors: exploration and discovery, looking at your natural environment and saying, hey, I think this is true. Let me go ahead and write this down and see if I can test that out. Analysis, so performing your experiments, and then seeking feedback from others in the scientific community who may have done something like this before, making sure you're kind of checking up with them, looking at different scientific journals, and then looking lastly at societal benefits and outcomes. So how does this benefit anyone? Who does it benefit? And what is the outcome that we're looking for? All right, so here it is. It's non-linear, which means you don't just go step by step by step. It can take you off in different directions the more things you observe. So exploration and discovery, formation and testing of that educated guess, that is your hypothesis. Feedback from the scientific community. It could be people who are in your classroom, your teachers, looking at different scientific journals to see like, maybe this kind of goes together, or someone has done this before. What did they observe? And how can I use that information to help me out with my testing hypothesis? And then looking at the societal benefits and outcomes. So who does this benefit? Is this beneficial for anyone? All right, so let's look at how biology and technology are connected. So the goal of science is to understand natural phenomena. So in contrast, the goal of technology is to apply scientific knowledge for a specific purpose. So these two fields are actually interdependent, which means they depend on each other to come up with new technologies and new ideas. And now this grouping is actually combined into a subject called biotechnology, which is really, really interesting. All right, let's go on to the last part of this lecture, which are the 5 unifying themes in biology. So evolution is the core theme of biology, and that means that life is distinguished by its unity and also its diversity. So how things are alike, but also how they are different. So the scientific explanation for this is something called evolution. It's the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from its very earliest, very simplest forms to the vast array of distinct organisms that we have today. So just looking at birds, they've all started from a common ancestor, but look at here. You have the flamingo, the hummingbird, the penguin. So these are all very, very different examples of one type of species. So Darwin, I'm sure we all heard of that guy before, right? He synthesized the theory of evolution by natural selection. So the observations were that there are heritable variations that led to an overproduction of offspring. So what he figured out was that natural selection is, if you've ever heard of this term before, survival of the fittest. So that unequal reproduction led to evolution of adaptations in populations. And that just means the features that lent itself the most to survival were the features that were in the offspring that actually survived. And so because those offspring survived and mated with each other, they were able to produce more offspring with those same heritable traits that led to more survival. So that's natural selection, survival of the fittest. Who is the best to survive these different environments? Okay, so looking here, population with varied inherited traits, elimination of individuals with certain traits, and reproduction of the survivors only. So let me get my little pen out again. So looking here, kind of picking out the bugs that, these are the bright white ones. They kind of stand out more. You can see them more. The little bird came in and ate the bright ones, and the darker ones were able to adapt and not get eaten. So now this increases the frequency of traits that enhance survival and reproductive success. So you can kind of see here, the darker colored bugs are reproducing with each other and producing more darker colored bugs. And now the birds can't really see them to pick them off and eat them. So survival of the fittest. All right, so each species on Earth has a family history. So a species represents one twig on kind of a huge branching tree of life that extends back in time through series that get kind of more and more spread out. So talking about our red panda again, here is our red panda. Okay, here is our raccoon, and here is our giant panda. So even though the red panda is just by itself in its own family, it is related to raccoons and weasels, but it's also related to giant pandas. Okay, And that's how they kind of came to be. So evolutionary theory is useful in medicine, conservation, and agriculture. So modern times, we actually selectively breed plants and animals, and humans can also act as those changes of evolution. For example, the banana, most of our fruits and vegetables, grains, things like that, those have all been pretty much genetically modified for our consumption. All right, so as a result of this, it is called artificial selection. So our crops, our livestock, and our pets, they really don't look a lot like how they used to look back in the wild. All right, so the process of life depends on the transmission and use of information. So looking at this, DNA, I'm sure you've all heard about that before. It's responsible for heredity and for programming the activities of a cell by providing a blueprint for proteins. So what that means is that DNA make up something called our genes. Okay, and those genes are what determine what kind of proteins we make, how many proteins we'll make, and whether those proteins are either active or more silenced. So DNA is that blueprint. So just think of DNA as kind of like the alphabet, right? So we have 26 letters in our alphabet, and combining those different letters together make up different words that actually have different types of meanings. So DNA is the same way. Taking those different parts of DNA, combining them in different ways conveys different types of meaning for our bodies, okay? So kind of relating it back that way. Here's a picture of our DNA and the different language that we use. We only have 1, 2, 3, 4 types of nucleotides, and just the different combinations that we have of these, they produce different types of languages for our bodies, for our cells, for how we function in life. Okay, so we go from DNA. That little piece of DNA makes up a gene. That gene is then transferred to something called RNA or mRNA. It then goes out into the cell, and that RNA is made into a protein. It's translated into a protein. So DNA goes through different steps of processes to become a protein. And then proteins do pretty much everything else in our body for regulation, transport, all kinds of things. Okay, so our different types of languages within our body. Okay, so another theme is that structure and function are related. So the relationship between structure and function can be observed at every level of life. So at the molecular level, the structure of a protein helps to determine its function. So for example, hemoglobin, which is found in our red blood cells, they transport oxygen in our blood. On the cellular level, the long extensions of nerve cells help them to transmit impulses made from our spinal cord all the way down to our toes. Okay, so looking back at this, the red panda, it has something called a false thumb, which helps it to pick up and grasp its food. So that structure is helping the panda to pick up the food. So structure and function. All right, another theme is that life depends on the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. So energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. It enters as sunlight. It's converted to chemical energy by the producers, which are typically plants. They are passed on to consumers, so usually animals and humans, and then exiting as heat or energy. So typically it'll flow from the sun all the way down to our plants. The plants provide food, and then as we eat the food, we kind of transfer that energy we take to actually take in the food. We actually emit it as heat. All right, so ecosystems are characterized by the cycling of matter. And what that means, they get it from the atmosphere and soil, Matter is through producers, consumers, and decomposers, and then it goes back out into the environment. So just a big circle. So let's look at an example of that. So we have the sun, which is that inflow of light and energy. Then we have the producers, which are our plants. They help to make the chemical energy that is found in food. The consumers are the animals. And then lastly, as those consumers eat these plants, you get an outflow of heat. So it's released from the environment. All right, so the last thing that we have here is that life depends on interactions within and then also between systems. So the study of life goes from the very, very smallest microscopic scale, so things like atoms and molecules and cells, to a global scale that involves our entire living planet. So all these things interact and have connections within their cells and without of themselves. Using an approach called systems biology, scientists attempt to model the behavior of biological systems by analyzing the interactions among the different parts of a system. All right, so we've reached the end of this lecture. Let me know if you have any other questions, and make sure that you complete the questions that are here at the end of this lecture right below it. All right, thanks for watching. Have a good day.